Everybody screams, oh, heavy rare earths in USA and terrible. Well, last year China exported to the US 60 kilograms of dysprosium, 10 kilograms of terbium. It's not really a very relevant market.
Energy. Hey, it's Tucky.
I don't know if you've been following what's going on in the rare earth market lately. You've been paying attention.
Rare earths have become the hottest topic in global news, right? China, US, embargoes, export, crunch downs.
It's gone mainstream, like the conversation around rare earths, which is kind of crazy because we're in the world of like mining news, and I don't feel like I know enough about this yet. Somehow the mainstream has like an opinion on rare earth projects. Like share prices of weird projects are going crazy. It's a truly bizarre time.
Weird projects, to say the least.
Yeah. So I just really wanted to kind of get to the bottom of what's going on, what it means, what's relevant to markets, by summoning three of the best thinkers I know that are obsessed and addicted to the rare earth industry.
A truly all-star crowd, like Rare Earth Observer, DK, Sustainable Dude. This is, all-star type material to actually just teach us and help us and the money miners learn about what is going on, right?
Absolute all-star crowd.
I'm pretty excited to share this conversation.
This panel of absolute rare earth experts, JD, is brought to you by the mining experts, MMS Mineral Mining Services.
Mate, the team that specialises in maximising operational efficiencies across WA mine sites.
Mate, MMS, the go-to name when it comes to turnkey contract mining services, all the way from technical services to your open pit mining.
Here's what you need to know, money miners. They will tailor the solution to fit your needs. There is no job across the state that they can't handle. They just get it done.
JD, the proof is in the pudding here. With the results they've delivered for companies across the state, came from nowhere, they are killing it.
Get in touch with MMS and see what value they can unlock for you.
Get it done. Go MMS.
Go MMS.
Utterly delighted to be joined by three of the preeminent experts in the rare earth industry. This expert panel is led by none other than the Rare Earth Observer, Thomas Kruemmer. Everyone would be very familiar with your blog, which is prolific for anyone who wants to get up the curve in rare earth. An up-and-coming person who's been writing very thoughtfully is Sustainable Dude, which is the frog you see on camera right now. Hilarious. Well done. I'm loving that, Sustainable Dude. And to round out the panel, we've got Dylan Kelly, or DK, of Terra Capital, who has come on before and has that investor lens in the buy-side kind of equities and the names, and has shared with us generously in the past his rules for investing in the very complex rare earths space, because buyer beware a lot of the time. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time to talk about rare earths. What a topical commodity to be talking about right now. I've never seen rare earths so hot, although I'm sure they have been in the past. It's not entirely rare after all for it to be topical.
No, true. I think I also made a tweet about this before. Interest in rare earths was a red flag, consider it a red flag, and now it's market foresight, so times can change.
Absolutely. What is going on? I'm struggling to make sense of what's real, what's not, what's policy, what's conjecture, what is moving markets. Like, if we were just to kind of step back and assume that I know nothing about what's happening geopolitically right now, which is true, what the hell is going on?
I want to go straight to the GOAT on all things in this subject matter. Thomas, what's the story, mate? Is the geopolitical problem reality, or is it really just a fuss about nothing?
Well, when China started messing around with gallium and germanium, I mused that if they would blanket ban rare earth exports, they would shoot themselves with an elephant rifle into both feet. So, and actually they didn't. Several years ago, I think somebody in the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that China does not want to aid the production of weapons that can threaten China. And what they did, I think, over many years, was to work out which are the most relevant materials. And I think this 7-element ban, or say dual use classification, may have come anyway. It is not really related to the trade war, and that is why the Americans have also so much trouble to make the Chinese take a step back from that. Because from the Chinese side, it may not be really related. It would have come anyway. My view for all of these 7 elements, for each of them, there is at least one Pentagon contractor who is a major user of this product, of the relevant product. That is probably why these 7 were chosen. The 7 also refer to the 6 strategic weaknesses that the Chinese military has published. I think it's less trade war related. Also now the result from the talks in London shows that the Chinese side has absolutely no intention to reverse this in any way.
Thomas, I'm quite interested, like dual use makes total sense to me. What I found really interesting is that like the 6 rare earths we've seen, so scandium I'm leaving aside right now because it's like we covered in a very different process than the other ones, generally. What I find interesting is it also coincides with very, I would say, vulnerable feedstock supply chain. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Does that play a role in this, what we've seen to date?
I think Dylan can sing a song about this. It is in general a problem of everyone who wants to enter rare earth, that rare earth production, rare earth separation, rare earth metal making, and so on, that the cost are and the capex are probably 3 times as high as they are in China. By extension, it would, like last year in Tokyo, we had the Rare Earth Industry Association conference, and I was hosting a panel of junior minor rare earth hopefuls. And I just tossed the question out, so what level must rare earth prices be so that you become feasible? And it was unisono the same. Prices must go up 3 times. That is a real problem. It's also related to the know-how. So if you look at recovery rates of junior rare earth miners in the West, they are below anything that would be licensable even in China. They really squeeze the lemon dry, whereas we recover anywhere between 40 and 80%, you know? So that already is a cost factor, the know-how.
Interesting. Would you say like putting such a system in place, like we've seen with this export licensing system, is also maybe to say Myanmar really gets messy? Like it's already messy, but there's still material flowing, albeit very varying per month. If that dries up, is this something to like, are the Chinese like hedging themselves here? Is that a possible scenario?
You see, one very common misunderstanding is that rare earth products should be commodities. It is, China has made great strides to commoditize them, to make sure that products are interchangeable, and therefore there is more competition among manufacturers. And of course, you can trade them on exchanges. Yeah? In the West, we have no industrial standards for rare earth products. I understand the International Standards Organization, ISO, has been on internationalizing Chinese industrial rare earth standards for 10 years. And I'm not sure if that is the preference of the ISO, but they've come up with sustainability standards, recycling standards, packaging standards, you know, all the fringe stuff, but nothing of substance. I asked one member of the group at ISO who is at it, and he claimed that the United States part of the ISO is not so really interested in having standards for rare earth products. So these are not commodities. Every user has his own purchase specification, you know, and their own test processes and so on. Nothing is standardized. So you can't, in the West, these are specialty chemicals. Yeah? And also you must really look at what are we actually buying in China. About 60 to 70% of the imports of the US, of Japan, of the EU are the rare earth elements lanthanum and cerium. What do we use them for? Well, we use them for the production of fossil fuels and the consumption thereof. Yeah, so we are talking about fluid cracking catalysts for producing gasoline, diesel, whatever you want, you know, and we are talking about the catalytic converter in internal combustion engine and hybrid cars. That is our main dependency in rare earth products.
No one talks about that.
have magnet dependency that is written on a different piece of paper in terms of rare earth. Yeah. Everybody screams, oh, heavy rare earths in USA and terrible. Well, last year, China exported to the US 60 kilograms of dysprosium, 10 kilograms of terbium metal, yeah, as metal, not as oxide, 10 tons of lanthanum metal, 12 kilos of scandium, and 236 kilos of metal alloys. These are the metals. If you go into the compounds, it's a slightly different picture. Yeah, but you know, it's not really a very relevant market.
Yeah, that's definitely a very good point. I think we just say the main concern with the USA government would be more in the high performance magnets now that we see humanoids potentially being deployed, EVs, these kind of things.
Yeah, see, the primary dependence of the West is on the products that are made from rare earths, including rare earth permanent magnets. We have no value chain behind it. That's why it's so funny, you know, if there's someone who says, oh, we are going to produce 4,000 tons of NdPr per year, you know, in Europe. Right. So who do you sell it to? There is nobody.
Crickets.
You need a metal maker who makes metal out of this, and then you need a magnet maker who takes the metal. But there is another little detail that everyone always forgets, you know. You leave the two elements, neodymium and praseodymium, in the proportion that you found them in your deposit. You don't separate them. But these proportions are different from deposit to deposit. Like Lynas says 78 to 22. I don't know right now offhand what this is at MP Materials. You know, the standard prescribes 75 to 25, 85 to 15, 70 to 30. You will not go lower than 70 to 30 because then praseodymium will kind of affect the coercivity of the magnet. These are not commodities. You get chemical compositions prescribed by your customer. And that says you have a 78 to 22 product and the customer wants 75 to 25. What do? Nobody is separating ND and PR. So where should the balance come from to make a metal that is according to the specification of the customer? Yeah. Really, people don't go into the details.
So that kind of throws into doubt the entire ability to have supply chain independence. You know what I mean? The specifications matter. It's almost implausible to build out an entirely independent supply chain that can meet unique customer demands independent of China.
Well, it sounds to me like, to that point, policymakers are pushing far too hard, thinking that they can build a supply chain out without realizing the full complexity of how many steps there are between pit top and finished product. The second part being how much noise is thrown at the wrong end of that argument and continually sort of pushed ahead without really thinking through the complexity, the cost, and the economics of this. It's farcical to think that we're ever going to chase, you know, supply chains that are this discombobulated with some sort of economic return of any stretch, even if we were to increase prices, you know, 3 to 4-fold. So in my mind, I think there's so many mainstream narratives that are spun on this space that just don't hold up to reality. I think, Thomas, you're making some good points, just cutting them off. But what do you make, Thomas? Is the world going mad over something that's largely irrelevant?
There are several points to observe. First of all, I think it is important to understand that the high performance NdFeB magnets, so these are the ones that still perform at high working temperature, say 180 degrees, you know, they are arguably maybe only half of the market. You have to visualize that China last year exported 58,147 tons of rare earth permanent magnets to 130 countries. These are often commodity magnets that can stand a working temperature of maybe 80 degrees Celsius. But which of our rare earth hopefuls wants to go for these magnets? Nobody. All of them claim for themselves that they can manage the high-tech composition of permanent magnets that are reaching a working temperature of 180 degrees Celsius or even 230 degrees Celsius. So they're trying the impossible rather than to go from the simple end first, because, since 2009, there has been no NdFeB production in the United States, In Germany, Vacuum have the minority joint venture with Junke Sanhuan in Beijing, where they get the blanks and ship them off to their subsidiaries for the final processing. We should have actually gone from the simple stuff that we may be able to do. And then, of course, after 2014, when China lost the WTO case of the EU, Japan, and the US, all efforts in the US rested. Everything just fell apart. In the EU, they continued, but it was more to prove activity rather than to come up with something tangible. So it was very important to support projects that are sustainable and environmentally benign. It was not on getting something done. We approached from two different ends and had nothing in the middle. See, it doesn't help us if we mine rare earth ores and concentrates if we do not have the industry that uses this and separates the rare earths, produces the more than 50 different compounds of rare earths that China exports to us, and then a further downstream industry which takes part of this, makes metals to supply those users who require metals.
Yeah, I think that's very unique about the supply chain as we see nowadays, especially when we're trying to build in the West, is we're trying to build this from upstream to downstream. Normally, you would do it the other way around, from downstream to upstream. And like Thomas mentioned, these aren't really commodities in the general sense. So there's so much variety between the mineral concentrates you treat, the carbonate, if it's oxide, the many things. And now we're seeing a host of junior mining projects which are trying to market their products. They're finding no Western buyers. It's all going into China because China has many companies which can take these various products. So I think one of the most important things to do is, like Thomas said, build your magnet capacity in the West and then go search for feedstock subsequently.
I would say like 5-6 years ago, we should have simply started doing NdFeB magnets. And we would have sourced the metals in China. And we would have dared them not to supply them. And at that time, China had absolutely no appetite for confrontation. So we may have actually succeeded. Of course, what is always getting buried a little bit is the role that our Japanese friends played in this whole mess. First of all, Japan is regularly 40 to 50% of China's total rare earth compound and metal exports, of the export value, not of the volume. The volume is smaller. And they were sitting on the core patents for the NdFeB magnets. And Hitachi Metals had the arrogance to believe that they can influence the supply and demand of NdFeB magnets if they control the licensing of the process, that they don't give a license to anyone who wants one, but look at the whole market picture and see, oh, would this throw the market off balance, And that is why the Chinese sued Hitachi Metals. They said they're abusing their market power. Because Hitachi Metals, if somebody was using Hitachi's process and starting to produce NdFeB in China, Hitachi would sue them. But had this manufacturer asked for a license, he wouldn't have gotten it from Hitachi Metals. Had Hitachi Metals not had this policy, we would have probably a much larger distribution of NdFeB magnets left, right, center. And do you see any joint initiatives between the Japanese and the US? In Europe now you have this project that involves Solvay, Less Common Metals, and Carister. And they base on the assumption that they can get the Namibia Critical Metals Project Lofdal going, which is Sinotime with a very favorable proportional composition. But, this project is moving at snail speed, and I do not think it will get going before 2030, maybe not even beyond. Yeah.
Feedstock is definitely a problem which you see in many projects in the West. I do think we see a changing Western perspective on how we source, especially heavy rare earth concentrates. We saw the recent MOU, it's still an MOU, but Lynas entering an agreement with the Malaysian state of, I've got the state name, but for ionic clay concentrate, I think it might be a watershed point where Western companies may follow suit here in Malaysia. That Western companies are opening themselves up for, what is effectively in situ ionic clay leaching, which is environmentally questionable, I would say. I think Thomas and Dylan have some more perspective on this. But I do know that Malaysia is really looking to expand their industry. I think they want to target like 30,000 tons of trio by 2030, 10,000 tons of NdPr, which is, I think there might be Western companies that looking to tap into that.
I think that's an interesting point. Who would have thought that the Malaysians would actually want to increase the amount of rare earth production is coming out of the country?
Does it? The license still expires in a couple of years, doesn't
No, they'll continue to roll it,
it?
just as long as the WLP doesn't come anywhere near them.
Yeah.
But I think, there's, well, one point I wouldn't mind touching on is this notion that we all think about clays as being hosted in certain parts of southern China, branching off into Myanmar. But as we know, clay is somewhat abundant, and there seems to be a whole series of discoveries after discoveries scattered all over the place in high rainfall areas. Minister Ice and the caldera with MEI and VMM come to mind, but also what Cerro Verde's got. We're talking about some of the clays that are occurring up and down the Malaysian Peninsula. I mean, in my mind, it seems like we're discovering them relatively frequently, but the ability to actually bring these things into production is still another question. Thomas, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. In my mind, I was working the thesis that if clays work at Cerro Verde and it gets up and works and makes money, we probably don't need to build another hard rock rare earth vertically integrated mine. But it sounds like there's some troubles there. There's still some questions over it.
First of all, I would like to challenge the notion that we don't have enough feedstock. China imported last year as direct feedstock to the rare earth industry 177,000 tons. What is the lack of feedstock here? Then on top of that, if you add to that the heavy mineral sands, which by and large, in average, may contain about 1% monazite, some 2, some nothing. China imported 6.8 million tons of that, with the clear objective to extract monazite from that. See a totally different problem here, that is that rare earths love radioactivity. So inevitably, for practically most of the feedstocks, which sometimes includes ionic clay, there will be radioactive waste. In the US, there is only one private company that is licensed to dispose of such radioactive waste, that is Energy Fuels. In Europe, because of not in my backyard, there are only temporary reception facilities for nuclear waste. It is almost impossible to get some permanent facility going. I understand they are commissioning now something for nuclear fuel rods in Finland. But for this type of waste, mostly thorium, but then you have uranium, you have actinium, you have radium, nobody wants to have it. I mean, Solvay, they still have thousands of tons lying around in the La Rochelle factory since 1992. The total quantity got distributed, this is about 6,000 tons, plus the rest of the quantity somewhat distributed in temporary shelters across France, So the real point here is particularly the EU, but also the Americans, they actually can't handle it because they don't know where to put this waste. And frankly, they don't want to incur it because what? The products, say, like electric vehicles, shall appeal to environmentalists also, So how is that if at the front door, there are fights over permanent disposal facility for the radioactive waste that occurs when you want to produce the magnets for this electric vehicle, Then suddenly it doesn't feel so green anymore. And that is actually behind EU policy. They are looking for strategic partners, as far as possible away. So all this mess from mining and the radioactive waste subject is totally out of mind and out of sight, They selected a project in Malawi as a strategic project for rare earths. At their very front door, at the EU affiliate in Norway, there is a gigantic deposit that is really high in trio and that is very, very prospective. It beats anything else anywhere near the EU. But it has not become a strategic project because it comes with an ample portion of radioactive waste. Yeah, that is the fact. On top of that, they are also victims of the foghorns of junior rare earth miners who try to make people believe that udilite can be a rare earth resource. The research into separating rare earths out of udilite has been going on in Russia since 1930. So far, we don't have anything. And now one of the miners in Sweden with a udilite deposit, he now says, we are looking for financing to first dig the udilite out and then leave it there and wait until the process is found how to extract rare earth from that. Well, the Russians have waited for 95 years, so maybe we wait another 95, yeah. And it's the same in Greenland. Green was tested in the Ura-Ray program, and I got very interested. So I looked up all the documentation and everything, but it was not clear if they ever managed to extract any rare earths from that. So I wrote to the company who did the separation, 2 times. They didn't reply because they knew that I knew that they had failed. This is, of course, a side, say, war scene, but the real issue here is the environmental problems that the politicians in the US and also in the EU do not want to have these discussions about permanent disposal facilities of radioactive waste and things like that.
Isn't the permanent disposal facility, isn't that a sticking point for Lynas in Malaysia? Like, aren't they supposed to be building a PDF in country there?
Yes, they do. At great expense, they also built a facility to produce rare earth carbonate in Australia and extract the thorium content there. The composition of what is mined at Mount Weld has changed a little bit. But based on the previous composition, Lynas output of thorium per year was approximately 150 tons in a huge stack of phosphogypsum. I think the company had a point when saying this is really almost irrelevant, but Malaysia has been through the Bukit Merah disaster of Asia Rare Earth, a Mitsubishi company, where the contractor who had been hired to dispose of the thorium waste properly had dutifully discharged it wherever he deemed fit, by the roadside, basically, And that created higher cancer rates, miscarriages, deformations at birth, and things like that, the whole line. So in Malaysia, the rare earth mining that is now being supported from the ionic clays is called non-radioactive rare earth mining. So back to Lynas, they had to build a facility, but what is a facility? They dig a big hole and then they line it out with 2 liners of polyethylene plastic, and then they pile the phosphogypsum on it.
Versus what we're doing in Kalgoorlie, throwing it on the back of a truck and just putting it back in pit. No need. Carefree. Quite the contrast.
It is seriously a problem, and I think it would be much better if this was discussed openly and a solution would be offered rather than everybody keeps it under the carpet. Every junior miner who sends samples for analysis, for every drill hole, he gets the full composition of everything that is inside. And if you read the JORC reports, you also see that thorium and uranium was tested, but they never published the results. You have to dig that out, and calculate back, and then you come to a value that is the probably likely content of radioactive material, Like this Pensana thing in Angola. The whole area was peddled by the Angolan government for uranium and thorium, And then
Exactly.
early Pensana in their previous incarnation as Rift Valley were careless enough to publish the results of thorium and uranium as well, They will have 10 times the output of Lynas, and no one looks at the consequences.
I think one point I'd add to there, Thomas, when it comes to the radioactive elements around the clays, I managed to go out and visit Ansto not so long ago, and I know I'm going to butcher some of the quotes there, but one of the elements I came away from was the existence of low grade in a concentrate or low grade in situ is almost a side issue. It's what happens when you treat it in any sort of way. You get this activation of isotopes of those elements into some far nastier things that perhaps, well, I couldn't actually name some of the elements that were getting thrown off, but they sounded particularly bad. And perhaps I just simplified that whole sector as being simple. Okay, it's all the bad stuff has been washed away in situ. It's all clean and green. But it turns out, oh, hang on, you add a little bit of heat, add some chemicals in one way. Yeah, it can dramatically accelerate the concentration of those nasties and make it a transport handling issue and ultimately a disposal issue.
Yeah, and an IAC hopeful in Brazil had the experience of that. I look at it very primitively. Generally, thorium will drop out during flotation, but the uranium content is water soluble. This can go all the way to the final product, which also an American rare earth hopeful has experienced. And this is really something that needs to be dragged out into the open. I do not believe that we will get to any rare earth solution if we do not address these issues. See, the Chinese monazite is a typical usual suspect. Monazite, the classic monazite, has about 5 to 6% of thorium and about 0.5 to 0.6% of uranium inside, plus other nasties, but that is basically it, So monazite is actually a fantastic ore to use for rare earths, for a rare earth separation. It's not bad. China banned the mining in 2012 because they had absolutely no control over where this waste is going. And it was going into rivers and lakes, and landfills and so on, 2014, they closed all known IAC deposits in South China, also for environmental reasons. This leaching with ammonium sulfate is a disaster for the water resources, be it groundwater or surface water. And I'm sorry to say, but in Malaysia, I've seen 2 environmental risk assessments filed on ministry websites, and the assessments were very open about it. And they disappeared from the websites, strangely. On the internet, things evaporate, you can't control it. So this is something that they completely ignore in Malaysia. And that is not good, because what is the alternative to in situ leaching? In situ leaching, you can leave the trees where they are. If you go for strip mining and tank leaching, what do you do to the rainforest? Yeah.
No, absolutely. In tank leaching might be even more environmentally.
So actually, I think ion adsorption clays are an aberration. It's not going. On top of that, since we are not good at it, we've seen that with junior miners with their trial leachings. They managed to leach the physically bonded ions, but the chemically bonded ones not. So our recovery rates are anywhere between 40 and 60% on an already low trio resource. Yeah, this is all not very good. So I think it's an aberration. I really think we should go for the traditional ores that are provenly working.
I'll happily take the other side of that trade, just to be the arbiter of companies doing things better than what they've been done in the past.
Is your view there, DK, that in situ will return and it'll be done responsibly, or do you think it'll be done, tank leaching?
If it's going to be in Western hands through North American Australian listed group, you're not going to get away with it. Full stop. It's just never going to get off the ground. Investors won't back it. We won't back it. These guys need to bend over backwards to ensure that whatever they're doing, the footprint and the externalities environmentally are rock solid. I think every site visit that we went to in Brazil always went through the process about looking at what nearby mining operations from bauxite had done on the rehab front. And there seems to be a pretty simple case about the fact that it's so low strip it's relatively like thick, and therefore the footprint isn't actually that big. And in such a high rainfall area, the ability to regenerate was pretty high. But it was all about the chemistry set, about what you were putting back into the ground. I mean, get rid of the ammonium sulfate, of course, but what was being put back in. And I think that's what I observed to be probably spending a lot more time in terms of the test work, trying to understand how can they put something back that's inert and the cost associated with that. There's always seemed to be lots of different tanks and lots of different complex parts of the flow sheet trying to get that right. Can it be done? Well, I'm not sure. I haven't seen it yet, but to do what is like a cottage industry function in certain parts of southern China and now Myanmar, they can't doing it like they've done. It's not going to happen anywhere else that's got Western oversight. So I kind of feel we could do it, but at what cost? And could they ever raise capital? I doubt it.
What is going on with Sierra Verde at the moment? I know that they needed more capital recently, some ramp-up challenges, but will more capital fix their issues and they'll find a way to be profitable?
Yes, so it's really hard to. So, sorry, go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, no, please go ahead.
No, I only have a few words to say about this. I mean, they're private. We don't hear really much about them, or they're not really putting any information out there. There are some voices in the industry that say like they have a problem with their filter systems, which are kind of ruining recoveries there. That's all I know. So from what I've heard, the ramp up is not going as planned. Maybe Thomas can give more perspective on this, but this certainly has like will have influence on what we'll see happening at Meteoric and Veritas.
Yeah, the mining doesn't only happen in Myanmar, it also happens in Laos at ever increasing rates. And also in Malaysia, we are seeing more and more coming out of Malaysia. I know a couple of guys there. There is, of course, Chinese capital and Chinese labor involved in Malaysia. Anyway, it is done the cheapest possible way. And if you pump ammonium sulfate solution into the ground, 10 millions of liters, it's naive to assume that you could clean this up in any way. This simply doesn't happen. So tank leaching, well, we know that these type of clays, they are found in areas of heat and a lot of rain. So that's basically tropical rainforest. So if we say, okay, this deposit is very wide, it is only 40 meters deep, or let it be 50 meters, we strip mine it, you have to remove all the greenery. And you will not restore a forest within a few years. This simply doesn't happen. There are also cases where strip mining is removing a layer of clay that used to be holding the water, so that the soil remained humid, and suddenly you have desertification. Some satellite photos from Myanmar suggest that happening, So I really do not believe in ion absorption clays being a solution of the problem.
So that raises an interesting question. Say we don't want to source heavy from ionic clays. Where do we source them? I mean,
very small deposits. It's also sometimes part of monazite deposits. Monazite itself tends to have a favorable composition. And don't forget, we are engineering, for example, for the magnet rare earths, whether in the West or in the East, particularly in China, we are engineering the heavy rare earths out. Because this is something that most junior rare earth miners simply don't understand, the rare earths inherent imbalance. Every deposit has a different proportional composition, but none of them has a composition that is exactly according to the market demand. So that means if we want to produce enough neodymium for the market demand, we overproduce lanthanum, cerium, and samarium, and we underproduce dysprosium, terbium, and probably holmium. So if we then say, no, we change that, we make dysprosium the target and we produce dysprosium according to market demand, then we will overproduce also neodymium and praseodymium and everything else for that matter. And God save us if thulium one day should take off, the whole balance will be screwed. You have to, there's a reason why lanthanum costs only 60 cents. There's a reason why cerium only costs $1.60. There's a reason why terbium costs $1,000. You throw the whole thing out of balance, whatever you do. And this is something the Chinese have been wrestling with for decades. And people from the outside who look at it, they think, oh, they are manipulating the prices. They keep it cheap in order to keep us out of the market. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is supply and demand. And it's the living hell of the rare earth inherent imbalance that you see at work.
That's all very good points. I totally agree with you there, which does raise an interesting question. You talked about natural ratios. We've seen the big carbonatites in monazite. Xenotime is very different. But since I only know of one pure play xenotime deposit, which has like a small chance of making it, Brown's Range, I think you know it very well. So what could be, if we don't want to do in situ leaching, what could possibly fill this gap? Are there more pure xenotime deposits? Do prices need to rise in order for Brown's Range to be economical?
Yeah, first of all, there are two projects under development. One is Northern Minerals, and the other one is Namibia Critical Metals. These are the famous ones under development. The other thing is, and that is also where China is the trailblazer, they engineer dysprosium and terbium out of the magnet. For example, they have a technology and it's patented, it's grain boundary diffusion. The idea is, okay, we need to alloy the NdFeB magnet so it becomes more heat resistant. But where does the heat impact the magnet? On the surface, not inside. So inside, you don't need that much dysprosium. You actually don't need any at all. You need it at the outside. This grain boundary diffusion technology allows them to reduce the dysprosium content while maintaining the temperature resistance, you know? So there are two ways to address this. One is, of course, produce a little bit more, but the other one is to engineer them out of the applications as far as possible.
To what degree do you think like the easy gains have been made on that front? Like
Boundary
diffusion has been around for a couple of years. Like,
yes,
will we see a demand plateau here, or will we see further reduction?
Well, there's another trend that was discussed last year at the Rare Earth Industry Association conference. I do not know what has become of this, but it's simply cooling. You have a cooling system, you have batteries that get hot, and when they get hot, they don't perform that well. So there are automotive developers who work on an electric vehicle cooling system, in which case you don't need a working temperature for the magnet of, say, 180 degrees Celsius, but you could maybe live with 150 or even lower. That's the application research. We must not forget that the Western automotive manufacturers like things cheap. The neodymium magnet is the most energy efficient and powerful and lightweight magnet that we know. But you know, do we need passenger vehicles with 400 horsepower that accelerate from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in 3 seconds on our highways and in our congested cities? I mean, I had a car in Toronto, you know, jogging was faster. So to say there are alternative motors, say magnet-based ones, or you look at BMW, who build a complete powertrain. All this is possible. Of course, then defenders of NdFeB and of top performance will say, oh, but then the battery, then you don't get a range of 800 kilometers, you only get 600 kilometers. Who cares? Seriously, battery technology is moving on. We are going to see the solid state battery with a range of 1100 kilometers given an NdFeB motor. If it then with a ferrite motor only delivers 700 kilometers, who cares? Yeah.
DK, you've had a long time view on backing the incumbents. I'm curious to hear your somewhat enthusiasm from an equity perspective on the ionics. Have your rules changed?
So let's go back over the rules quickly. So back the incumbents, barriers to entry far too high, capital cost, operating cost, economic returns are a no-go. Number two, never go full retard. Stay upstream. You go from a mine to a concentrate, maybe a carbonate. And that way you're probably going to just do a Forrest Gump or a Rain Man. Like to go any further downstream into separated oxides through con, mixed carbonate, crack it, separate it, that's to go full retard. That's like IM-SAM, simple jack
Simple
material.
Jack.
Simple jack. So very, very sort of precise focus on the strategy, flow sheet, and the test work. Final element, if we do start straying into large scale separation tech, you need the explicit backing of a state. So what we've seen with Iluka coming in, being backed by Australia, quasi by the US, what Lynas had with the Japanese, that sort of equivalent sort of backing. So the strategies I thought were appealing around clays remained relatively positive. I think everything was hinging on this Serra Verde getting up, and the trouble that we just discussed briefly before indicates that, well, the problems are perhaps more than we thought. And if it's a black box and no news is getting out, and I think Thomas has put out a couple of posts citing the fact that they've had some straggly export trade data come out that indicates that it's perhaps not working. Well, maybe the test work wasn't done enough. Maybe it was forced at the wrong time by a private equity group that perhaps wasn't necessarily focused on the problems on the ground with solving that needed to happen on the flow sheet. In my mind, I find it very hard to get constructive on other types of development plays in the equity space. I think Brazilian rare earths and what they're doing, or perhaps what they've got with this high grade, high uranium, high grade core, was it TREO values of over 10%, 4,000 ppm uranium. That's something different. That's interesting. That's high NSR material. But obviously there's the problems of the flow sheet. So in my mind, MEI, VMM, they still have a strategic appeal in terms of that potential sort of disruption concept. But I think Thomas is making some good points there around rehab, treatment properly. And I think some of our recent technical discussions or deeper dives there have indicated that we've perhaps simplified the radionuclide issues to a point where we're overlooking far bigger problems. Like the chemistry set in these things is unbelievably complicated no matter which set you look at. Clays are something different, only a couple of stages, basic leaching. But every time I've looked at a project, the closer you dig, the more convoluted and complex it becomes. So I think in my mind, you're still backing the incumbents, and I say smaller isolated exposure to those that can disrupt the market through conventional simple means by only going upstream, focusing on those names.
I found that point on Serra Verde interesting, JD. Like, what maybe some work wasn't done properly to understand things when you were doing the work, to put it all together. Maybe things were, is that a function of the amount of drilling that was done? Is that a function of the sample management? Because you know what sorts out both of those things?
Poking a few holes in, mate.
Really drilling.
And if you are going to drill, mate, there's only one team to go with, the mighty K-Drill.
K-Drill, mate. Doesn't matter if there's a few exploration holes or a multi-year program to prove it up. They'll look after you.
And like you were saying, mate, not just a matter of punching in the meters, right? You want to get it done safely and you want to get it done productively. No downtime, no dramas, no hassle. K-Drill.
Beyond productive drilling, you want sampling. Sample matters, mate. It's got to be reliable, clean, accurate, no contamination. You've got to be able to trust the numbers.
And last but not least, mate, the team has got decades of years of experience. They'll mobilise quickly and they'll just get the job done. Doesn't matter where in the state they are, they get the job done for you.
It doesn't matter the type of drilling, they find a way. It's just simple as that. Go K-Drill.
Look at the market caps of Lynas and MP and Lynas is like a $9 billion Australian company now and doesn't make money. Like top line revenue in the entire, between MP and Lynas is like 550 million last quarter, and look at the collective market cap of those two companies. It's enormous. So the equity valuations are baking in much, much, much higher prices. Is it realistic to think that way about the future?
I suppose it's more of a discussion for the team here. Look, in my mind, businesses like this it's not producing a commodity, it's producing a specialty chemical product. They can do so at high margin to a very grateful customer base that's got some sort of certainty for an ex-China supply chain. It's hard to do. Barriers, the moat's enormous. They probably should be trading at something like a uranium Cameco kind of multiple. I don't necessarily think about this in terms of like an NdPr function, but you've got to value these guys somehow on a commodity price in the future. But this is a very complicated product to wrap your head around in terms of the supply and demand function and what's going on in China. So all I'll say, and I'll lead into my two colleagues here, in my mind, yes, prices need to rise, threefold in order to get to incentive levels for Western developers. But what's missing from that discussion is what cost of production is for an upstart in the developing world and their cost of production and their cost of capital. In my mind, there's a lot of supply that can come on. As we know, it's pretty abundant in the Earth's crust. If there's a simple processing mechanism that can be tapped, we've got to be thinking about this alongside an existing cost of production competition.
Yeah, those are very interesting points you make, Dylan, and I totally agree. Also, to your point of investing upstream to the concentrated carbonate level, I totally agree there. Especially when you're producing concentrate, we see so many miners who just fail at the PEA studies before they concentrate, so they just decide to go to carbonate. But the funny fact is, carbonate, it's a 0% margin value add there. It's not making any money. It's even just inflating your capex and your ability to get this mine online. I actually do take the counterpoint there. I think there's a lot of supply that might come online in the next few years. In the short term, 3 to 5 years, I have quite some confidence in energy fuels. The main cost structure in producing the oxide is the concentrate itself. What energy fuels is doing very smartly is they're sourcing their monazite byproduct from their heavy mineral sands. So they can probably source at like half the concentrate cost of other producers, which gives them some flexibility for their extraction circuit and oxide production there to do it at low cost. Also on Brazilian rare earths, I'm finding these guys pretty interesting. I do agree that the flow sheet is probably more complex than we've seen to date in many miners. They found this new mineral phase. It's called chefkenite. We haven't seen this on a commercial scale to date in the industry, but actually published today some pretty interesting metallurgy results on their MREC. So they produced a clean MREC just with direct leaching of their ore, which is interesting. I do agree, like from a capital return perspective, almost none of these miners are going to make it. Like, let's look back at the last 20 years. We've seen an MP restart. We've seen Mount Weld come into production and Zara Verde. That's 3 mines in 20 years. How many juniors are there out there? Probably 100. So you're really looking for these juniors. If you're looking at hard work, you're looking at like a high startup pit, high grades, probably 15% trio, somewhere around that range. If you want to have a capital payback, and then you can go lower. But let's realize that at MP, it's like 6% trio, which is already loss making. So that's probably your lower boundary there.
I think, if I may say, why did Lynas work? Because, of course, they have a very, very patient financer who also had to rescue them in between. And the more important thing, they had a ready market, Japan. Japan is the only functioning rare earth market outside China. The rest of us are only extras, basically. So Lynas had the support from Japan, from the Japanese non-government entity that is very governmental, and the Japanese market. That is very, very important. This is how they could grow. MP Materials, in my opinion, they could reopen the mine because the Chinese shareholder offered them the market to sell the concentrate. MP were making money until they started fiddling around with things, trying to introduce a separation process and separate NdPr and probably also some lanthanum cerium. And that I think is where the misery started. Because see, Lynas now want to increase production capacity. But already now, where does their NdPr go? Japan has a market of 5,200 tons of neodymium and NdPr per year. So where does the rest go? China. And then they conveniently stop separating at the promethium gap. So they have the so-called SEGH, which is samarium, erbium, gadolinium, and holmium, which the concentrate of which they send to China. And they can be so grateful that China is taking it. And then this Me Too company called Brazilian Rare Earths, yeah, they go and say, oh, we will produce a carbonate that is marketable. Marketable to whom, please? Who will buy this? Yeah. And then we will also have an SEG that will find a ready market. Where, please? Assuming that China will forever be the trash can for junior rare earth miner concepts, I would not be so sure. What we are looking at in the current politics may well be China getting selective on what it buys from whom. Previously, China was not interested in what rare earth was produced from imported rare earth raw materials. Since this year, it is. So everything falls under quota. And then they've clearly shown that they may become selective, because the Malaysian government has been asking China for rare earth technology for years, for licensing. So ahead of Xi Jinping's recent visit, licenses were prepared for the in situ leaching and the carbonate production from IAC deposits. A week before Xi Jinping went to Malaysia, these licenses were ready to be sent. But this is something that the miners in Malaysia already have. They have the Chinese workers there, they have the experts, they have the geologists, the geochemists, everything is there. They didn't need this. But the Malaysian government, of course, didn't know, so they were really, really grateful about these licenses. Yeah? But China has absolutely no intention to go beyond that. One thing I'd like to remark with regard to carbonate also, there's a very clearly visible trend that instead of shipping a comparatively low price carbonate, Myanmar, Laos, and also recently Malaysia actually ship mixed rare oxides. So after calcination, basically. The difference is the end user does not need to calcinate anymore. It can probably go directly into the solvent extraction. So this increases also the number of customers. So anyway, but I think we have to slowly get used to a situation where China is not available anymore to take junior miner raw materials, and that we are stuck with do it yourself. And then we also have to look at, producing market adequate quantities. It doesn't help you if you have a gigantic separation facility, if only for a fraction you have a market domestically and need to export the rest against China, So I think we need a complete rethink.
Isn't it kind of perplexing then if we all kind of agree that the equity case for almost every opportunity is dismal? Isn't it perplexing how much brain power we all put into this specialty commodity?
Mate,
I mean,
ever spent any time looking at some of the detailed financials about how much mining companies actually make?
that's a very good point. And I mean, what's also interesting is when we look at all these juniors, they all publish their MPV studies, you name it. Like you say, it's dismissal. Like almost none of these can ever make money. But I think something we have to accept is look at MP, look at Lynas. They traded like 5 times their MPV. Like that's just market reality. So it's very risky to invest in a junior based on that perception that once you start producing, it's gonna re-rate to such a level. But it's something we have to keep in mind. But basically, if you're still a junior, you value it on an NFV basis, it's very risky. And none of these juniors are, except a couple in my mind, are interesting to look at as a long-term investment.
We're also a little bit unfair. In our Western civilized nations, we completely lack the value chain of rare earths. So for junior miners to show something that is interesting, they have to get into something that they are actually not experts in and can never be. For a miner, he's turning out a concentrate. That's it. He's not supposed to produce an NdFeB magnet. The net working capital will crush him. Forget it. It just doesn't work. Or have you ever heard of an iron ore miner who's producing precision steel tubes? Yeah, so this would be the equivalent. Yeah, so it's maybe the expectation level is too high. What I would recommend is having a really, really close look how the value chain is structured in China, which is everyone is a specialist in his particular part of the value chain. And these are companies that are independent, that they have their own profit loss and balance sheet to make sure that at every step of the chain, there's at least break even. And at every step of the chain, you have your own imbalances in rare earths. So if you try to bring that under one roof, you will create one big mess. Keep it separate. One specialist, one specialist, one specialist. Do not force your junior miners to produce something they have no clue about. It's not fair.
Mine to magnet. That's the
Yeah, that
ambition
is,
of the junior miner that isn't even a miner yet.
No, mate, that's super special retard in that case. That's like, yeah, oxides is one thing, metal then to magnets. No, that's brain dead.
So this is like a pregnancy, you know. At the beginning, in months one, you produce some ore, and probably 9 months later, you know, you will finally produce some marketable product in form of a separated metal. Yeah, not good. And I think that's unfair because it also drives the capital requirements through the roof and all that. The approach of Ucore is actually quite okay. Unfortunately, they have a process there which probably doesn't work because, I mean, the grandmasters of rare earths in China have given up on a similar process already in 2011. But this is actually the correct approach. And some private companies, particularly in the US and Europe, who also say, no, we don't do any mining, we do the separation. That's our job. And then LCM come in, metal maker, metal expert. Nobody will challenge them because they are the guys who know how to do this. Yeah. And the same goes further downstream than, for example, for the magnet makers.
Thomas, what are we to make of? I mean, you talked about like why was Lynas successful? They had the market before the selling to. We live in a time now where a project like any other is getting financed. There's no market for that product, so now the government's coming in, and that will be the market. They'll buy the product. Like, what are we meant to make of that? Like,
which project?
Lucas Enyaba.
Oh yeah. Okay, Australia. My primitive view is you can already not profitably mine nickel in Australia. What makes you think that rare earths will be any better? So I really think that the capital expenditure amounts that are put out there for these projects in general are way too high. I mean, even heavy mineral sands, you know, the amounts are just flabbergasting. This doesn't fly. I think that is more of a general problem in Australia. Yeah, and $2 billion for a separation of monazite is,
if we're lucky,
Australian dollars, of course, but this is it's too much. It cannot be. Yeah, cannot work.
what do you make of the current status of geopolitical dynamics with rare earths being this real point of leverage? Do we expect any change here? Do we think things will ease on any of the fronts in that respect, or do you think this is the new status quo?
The capacities in China are gigantic. Yeah, you have basically three dominant rare earth compound manufacturers, plus about several dozens of independents. And I don't want to be too specific, but I think the base capacity for separation in China is 510,000 tons. And then you have a rare earth permanent magnet capacity that is above 600,000 tons already. Last year, the utilization rate in rare earth permanent magnets in China was barely 60%. I've done metal business for about 20 years, and in my opinion, any utilization rate below 70% and you start writing losses, you know. With this in the background, I completely fail in understanding how China wants to hamper exports. As I mentioned, last year they exported 58,147 tons of rare earth permanent magnets to 130 countries. This is an enormously dominant position. And now they force practically the main players to have their own supply. Where does this leave China's monopoly? Where does this leave the advances that they made? It will all come to nothing. We must hear the explosions and we must do something. So, and I think in terms of EU, the idea with Solvay and Carester is nice, but we have to address the issue of processing primary raw materials in the EU with the resulting radioactive waste. This must come onto the table. This is the problem of the origin countries. You cannot do that. This is not okay. If you want to benefit from the added value, you also have to deal with the problems. And don't forget, all of them signed on to the Treaty of Nuclear Non-Proliferation, the NPT. There are accession protocols where there are quantities inside which define how much radioactive material you can produce a year, and all of them will exceed them. So the IAEA would need to be involved if you want to leave it in the countries of origin. So I think there we should be more forthcoming and honest.
No, I totally agree there. And I think that's a very big advantage that China has. China is a country led by engineers, by smart people who see this as it is. We also tend to be very emotional in that sense, I guess. Radioactive is bad stuff. It is bad, but if you handle it in a proper way, its effects can be mitigated very efficiently. And if you want to produce anything of volume in the West, we need to deal with this stuff. We need to deal with thorium. Clays are relatively low in thorium, but any hard project that's not bastnasite will be high in thorium. You can produce a relatively clean thorium concentrate. You can put it back in the pit. There are multiple solutions there. We need to address this if we want to have a chance as a Western supply chain.
I think for me, perhaps I was being a bit dismissive of the sector in terms of its ability to generate cash. In my mind, it's very simple for us to oversimplify what's going on here. If we've learned anything from the last 30 years of BHP and Rio eliminating the downstream, it's always to focus on what you can do best, focus on the upstream. We're a country, or in this part of the world, or primary markets, we're a dig and ship economy. We're still pushing product offshore. So I think to do the advanced chemical engineering takes a different set of skills and a different set of knowledge to be able to navigate how to do this in an economic way. In my mind, I'm still find it fascinating. I still think there's a lot of alpha to be found, but understanding the chemistry and the complexity of these flow sheets and the permitting, I think there's a lot more work still to be done. But I'm still enjoying it, and particularly enjoying talking about it with these two gents.
Is there any like market activity we can anticipate? Like, do you guys have any theories about deals in the space that make sense or are likely?
Can we go back to that? It was only a very small news blip, but Lynas and MP possibly coming together. It's old news. But I always liked the notion that if we're going to compete with China in any way, shape, or form, you're better off doing this together. Consolidating rest of world supply, I think strategically and from a marketing perspective makes a lot of sense. Not that I know anything in particular, but that's something that's rattling around in the back of my head. And the ability to grow with manufacturing, reshoring, nearshoring going on, I think that opens up several possibilities. So in my mind, that's something I'm keeping a close eye on. I'm also keeping an eye on what's happening with Iluka in terms of third-party feedstock. That's something that continues to burn in the back of my mind, and what opportunities that may open up, whether it's for an NTU. There's some development company or development projects that look pretty good on face value that might be coming into the space. We still need to see how they're going to get a price that's going to justify the investment. So coming back to that point around price bifurcation, which I think is a bit of a fantasy, maybe we do not need to start seeing what happened in the US, whereby correct me if I'm wrong here, Thomas, but there was some sort of domestic incentive price or floor price given to US producers of a domestically manufactured magnet. Was it $25 or $30 US relative to the Chinese price at the time, which was something around 20. If you produced it in the US, there's a $5 head start. That type of mechanism I thought was really interesting and might lead the way in terms of getting us to figure this out on the downstream economic side of things, how this should work. And also a free open checkbook from the Australian government or the US also helps.
Excellent, guys. Thank you
I
so
like
much for sharing your insights. This has been just awesome. Truly grateful for the shared expertise of the three of you. It's been an absolute delight. So thanks so much, guys.
Cheers.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.
How good was that? I think we got some partners to thank after that absolutely ripping conversation, JD.
Mate, after that ripping conversation, we've got some ripping partners to thank. A big thank you to Mineral Mining Services, Grounded, Sandpit Ground Support, K-Drill, Cross Boundary Energy.
Hooroo.
Hooroo.
Now remember, I'm an idiot, JD's an idiot. If you thought any of this was anything other than entertainment, you're an idiot and you need to read out a disclaimer.